Marcus Chen adjusted his expensive camera strap and smiled widely at his girlfriend Sarah. The summer heat in London was unusual, but it made their vacation even more memorable. They had been planning this trip to England for months, saving every penny from their jobs back in Chicago. Marcus worked as a marketing manager, and he had a habit of always wanting the perfect shot for his social media accounts. "This is going to be amazing," Marcus said, pointing toward the iconic red gates of Buckingham Palace. "I'm going to get some incredible photos today. My followers are going to lose their minds." Sarah nodded, though she noticed the serious expressions on the faces of the royal guards standing at attention. These weren't actors or tourist attractions. They were real soldiers with real responsibilities. She had read about them before the trip, learning that they were highly trained military personnel who took their duties very seriously. The couple joined the crowd of tourists gathering around the palace. Marcus immediately began snapping photos, moving closer and closer to get better angles. He was particularly fascinated by one guard who stood perfectly still near the main entrance. The guard was young, probably in his early 20s, with sharp features and an unwavering gaze that looked straight ahead. "Look at him," Marcus whispered to Sarah, zooming in with his camera. "He's like a statue. I bet I can make him crack a smile or something." Sarah felt uncomfortable with the idea. "Marcus, maybe we should just take normal tourist photos. These guards are working." But Marcus was already lost in his own world, thinking about the likes and comments his photos would receive. He had over 50,000 followers on his travel blog, and he was always looking for content that would go viral. The idea of getting a reaction from a royal guard seemed like social media gold. He started taking photos from different angles, getting closer with each shot. The guard, whose name was James Patterson, remained perfectly still. James had been serving as a Queen's Guard for 3 years, and he had dealt with countless tourists who tried to distract him. It was part of the job, and he had learned to block out everything around him while on duty. Marcus grew bolder. He began making faces at the guard, trying to get him to react. He waved his hands, made silly gestures, and even tried making loud noises. Other tourists started watching, some finding it entertaining while others looked embarrassed by Marcus's behavior. "Sir, please step back," came a firm voice from another guard nearby. But Marcus was too focused on his target to pay attention. The crowd around them grew larger as people pulled out their phones to record what was happening. Marcus felt encouraged by the attention and decided to take things further. He approached the guard's post more closely, ignoring the clear boundaries that had been established for tourists. James could see Marcus approaching in his peripheral vision, but his training required him to maintain his position and composure. He had been taught that royal guards represent the dignity and tradition of the British monarchy, and nothing should compromise that representation. "Come on, buddy," Marcus called out loudly. "Just one little smile for the camera. It won't hurt anyone." Sarah tried to grab Marcus's arm. "Please, let's just go. You're making people uncomfortable." But Marcus shrugged her off, completely absorbed in his mission to create viral content. He had seen videos online of tourists trying to make guards react, and he wanted to be the one who finally succeeded. In his mind, it was all harmless fun. The situation was becoming more tense by the minute. Other tourists began to murmur disapprovingly, and some started taking videos of Marcus's behavior. Security personnel began moving closer, but Marcus didn't notice any of this. He was completely focused on the guard. James felt the weight of his responsibility heavily on his shoulders. He represented something much bigger than himself, the tradition, honor, and dignity of the British military and the royal family. Every day, thousands of tourists visited, and most were respectful. But occasionally, someone like Marcus would appear, treating the guards like entertainment rather than recognizing them as dedicated soldiers. The temperature seemed to rise as more people gathered. Marcus's behavior was creating a spectacle, and the atmosphere was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for everyone involved. Sarah looked around nervously, realizing that they were becoming the center of unwanted attention. Marcus took another step forward, now standing just inches from the guard's post. He raised his camera for what he thought would be the perfect shot, a close-up of the guard's face while he tried to make him break character. "This is going to be perfect," Marcus muttered to himself, completely unaware of how inappropriate his behavior had become. James could feel Marcus's presence very close to him now. His training kicked in, and he knew that if someone crossed certain lines, he would need to take action. The Royal Guards weren't just for show. They were active military personnel with real authority and responsibility to protect the royal residences. The moment was building to something significant. The crowd sensed it too, with more phones, appearing to record whatever was about to happen. Sarah felt a growing sense of dread, knowing that her boyfriend was pushing boundaries he didn't understand. Marcus raised his camera one more time, preparing for what he thought would be his masterpiece. Shot. He had no idea that his actions were about to lead to consequences he never could have imagined. The guard remained motionless, but something in the air suggested that this situation was about to change dramatically. The stage was set for a confrontation that would teach Marcus a lesson he would never forget, and give everyone watching a demonstration of what it truly means to cross the line with someone whose duty comes before everything else. The moment Marcus stepped inside the clearly marked boundary line, everything changed. James Patterson, who had been standing perfectly still for over an hour, suddenly came to life with military precision. His movement was so swift and unexpected that several tourists jumped back in surprise. "Make way for the Queen's Guard!" James's voice thundered across the courtyard, echoing off the palace walls with an authority that made everyone freeze. Marcus's camera nearly slipped from his hands as the guard began marching directly toward him. The sound of James's boots hitting the pavement created a rhythmic, intimidating beat that seemed to match the suddenly racing heartbeats of everyone watching. "What's happening?" Marcus stammered, looking around, confused. He had expected maybe a stern warning or for security to politely ask him to move back. He never anticipated this level of response. James marched with perfect military bearing, his rifle held at the proper angle, his red uniform impeccable despite the heat. His face showed no emotion, but his eyes were focused and determined. Every step was calculated, every movement precise. This wasn't a performance. This was a soldier doing his duty. The crowd of tourists quickly moved aside, creating a clear path. Many had their phones out, recording what was becoming an unforgettable moment. Some whispered nervously to each other, while others watched in stunned silence. Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm, trying to pull him away. "We need to leave right now," she whispered urgently. But Marcus seemed frozen in place, mesmerized by the approaching guard. He had never seen anything like this before. The guard's presence was overwhelming, commanding respect and attention from everyone in the vicinity. "Move!" James commanded as he continued his march. Marcus finally snapped out of his trance and stumbled backward, but he didn't move fast enough. James continued his approach, and Marcus found himself backing up against the growing crowd of spectators who had formed a circle around the scene. An elderly British gentleman in the crowd shook his head disapprovingly. "Tourists these days have no respect," he muttered to his wife. "In my day, people knew better than to interfere with the guards." A family from Germany watched with wide eyes, their children asking in hushed German what was happening. The parents tried to explain quietly while keeping their distance from the unfolding drama. James's march continued with unwavering determination. Each step seemed to echo Marcus's poor decisions, building tension that had everyone holding their breath. The guards' training was evident in every movement. This wasn't random or emotional. It was a calculated response to someone who had violated protocol. Marcus's face had gone pale. What had started as a fun photo opportunity for his social media was turning into something much more serious. He looked around desperately, hoping to find an escape route, but the crowd had formed a natural barrier around him. "I'm sorry," Marcus called out weakly, but his voice was lost in the sound of the marching boots and the murmur of the crowd. Sarah tried once more to reach for Marcus, but the intensity of the situation kept her frozen in place. She had never seen her boyfriend look so small and helpless. The confident, social media-savvy man she knew had been replaced by someone who looked like a child who had been caught doing something wrong. James's expression remained completely professional throughout. His approach, this wasn't personal for him. It was about maintaining the dignity and order that his position required. He had been trained for situations exactly like this, where tourists crossed boundaries and needed to be reminded of the seriousness of his role. The march continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 30 seconds. With each step, Marcus seemed to shrink further into himself, realizing the magnitude of his mistake. Other guards at nearby posts maintained their positions, but were clearly aware of what was happening. Their training taught them to support each other while maintaining their own posts, creating an atmosphere of unified military presence. A tour guide with a small group tried to quietly move her tourists away from the scene. "This is why we always tell people to be respectful," she whispered to her group. "The guards are real soldiers, not tourist attractions." Marcus's expensive camera, which had been so important to him just minutes before, now hung uselessly around his neck. All thoughts of viral videos and social media fame had evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of fear and regret. The marching finally stopped when James reached a position just a few feet from Marcus. The guard stood at attention, his presence commanding and intimidating. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the usual sounds of London traffic seemed muted. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. Marcus looked up at the guard towering over him, realizing for the first time that this was a real person with real authority, not just a colorful figure for tourist photos. James remained perfectly still for a long moment, letting the weight of the situation sink in. His silence was more powerful than any words could have been. The message was clear. Actions have consequences, and disrespect would not be tolerated. Marcus opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. He was completely out of his element, facing a level of authority and discipline he had never encountered before. The crowd continued to watch in fascination and nervous anticipation. This was clearly not over yet, and everyone sensed that whatever happened next would be something none of them would ever forget. Sarah stood frozen among the spectators, her hands covering her mouth in shock. She knew her boyfriend well enough to recognize that he was in completely over his head, facing consequences for behavior that had seemed harmless to him just moments before. James Patterson stood perfectly still in front of Marcus for what felt like an eternity. The silence was so thick that even the sounds of London seemed to fade away. Marcus could hear his own heart pounding in his ears as he stared up at the imposing figure before him. Then, without any warning or change in expression, James began to speak in a voice that was calm, controlled, and absolutely chilling in its professionalism. "You have violated the security perimeter of Her Majesty's residence," James stated, his words carrying the weight of centuries of military tradition. "You have shown disrespect to the crown and to the uniform I wear. Do you understand the seriousness of your actions?" Marcus's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He had never been spoken to with such authority in his life. Back home in Chicago, he was used to casual interactions, friendly banter, and the laid-back atmosphere of his marketing job. This was something entirely different. I was just trying to take some photos," Marcus managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. The crowd around them had grown larger, with people stopping their tours and daily activities to witness what was unfolding. A group of Japanese tourists had their cameras out, documenting what they clearly recognized as a significant cultural moment. Several British locals nodded approvingly at the guard's handling of the situation. James's eyes never left Marcus's face as he continued, This is not a theme park. This is not a movie set. This is the official residence of the British royal family, and I am a serving soldier of Her Majesty's army. My duty is to protect this place and maintain its dignity, not to provide entertainment for your social media accounts." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. He had never considered the guard as a real person with real responsibilities. In his mind, the guards were just part of the London tourist experience, like the red telephone boxes or double-decker buses. Sarah finally found the courage to step forward slightly, but James raised his hand with military precision, stopping her in her tracks without even looking in her direction. "Your girlfriend may approach, but she will remain silent," James commanded, his voice carrying such authority that Sarah immediately complied. Marcus felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the relatively mild temperature. The guard's complete control of the situation was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Every word was measured, every movement deliberate. "What is your name?" James asked, and something in his tone suggested that this wasn't a casual question. "Marcus Chen," he replied automatically, his marketing training kicking in even though he immediately regretted giving his real name. "Mr. Chen, you are from America, I presume." Marcus nodded, unable to find his voice again. James continued his controlled interrogation. "And you thought it would be amusing to harass a British soldier while he performed his duties?" "I didn't mean to harass anyone," Marcus protested weakly. "I just wanted some good photos. People do this stuff all the time online." The guard's expression didn't change, but something in his stance suggested deep disapproval. "People do many things online, Mr. Chen. That does not make them right, respectful, or legal." The word legal sent a chill through Marcus. He hadn't considered that there might be actual laws about interfering with the royal guards. His mind raced through worst-case scenarios: being arrested in a foreign country, international incidents, his job back home finding out about this. An older British woman in the crowd spoke up quietly to her husband. Good for him. These tourists need to learn some respect. Her words were just loud enough for Marcus to hear, adding to his growing sense of shame and isolation. James took a step closer, and Marcus instinctively stepped back. But there was nowhere to go with the crowd surrounding them. "Mr. Chen, I want you to look around," James commanded. "Look at the faces of the people watching this interaction." Marcus reluctantly lifted his eyes from the ground and scanned the crowd. He saw disapproval on many faces, embarrassment on others, and a few expressions that looked almost sorry for him. A child with his parents pointed at Marcus and asked loudly, "Why is that man in trouble?" before being quickly hushed. "What you see," James continued, "is what happens when someone fails to understand that respect is not optional. It is not negotiable. It is not subject to your personal entertainment needs." Marcus felt smaller with each word. His expensive clothes, his fancy camera, his social media following, none of it mattered here. He was just someone who had made a serious mistake and was facing the consequences. "I'm really sorry," Marcus said, and for the first time, he actually meant it. "I didn't understand." James studied Marcus's face carefully, as if measuring the sincerity of his apology. The guard's training included reading people, understanding when someone was genuinely remorseful versus just trying to escape consequences. "Your apology is noted, Mr. Chen," James replied. "But understanding the gravity of your actions requires more than words." Marcus felt a new wave of panic. What did that mean? Was he about to be arrested? Detained? His mind filled with images of international headlines. American tourist arrested at Buckingham Palace. Sarah stood frozen among the spectators, her hands clasped tightly together. She knew Marcus well enough to see that he was genuinely scared and sorry, but she also realized that this situation was far beyond anything either of them had experience handling. The tension in the air was so thick that even casual passers-by were stopping to see what was happening. The scene had taken on a life of its own, becoming an impromptu lesson in respect, consequences, and cultural understanding. James remained perfectly composed throughout the entire interaction, his military, bearing never wavering. This was clearly not his first encounter with an over-enthusiastic tourist, but his handling of the situation demonstrated years of training and experience. Marcus waited for whatever was coming next, knowing that his London vacation had just taken a turn he never could have imagined. James Patterson maintained his intense stare at Marcus for several more seconds before making his next move. Without breaking eye contact, he reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a small notebook and pen. The simple action sent another wave of fear through Marcus's already racing mind. "Mr. Chen," James said in his measured, professional tone, "you will provide me with your full name, your passport number, and the address where you are staying in London." Marcus's hands began to shake slightly. Are you arresting me?" "I am documenting this incident," James replied without emotion. "Your cooperation will be noted in my report, as will any refusal to comply." The crowd around them seemed to lean in closer, sensing that this was escalating to something more serious than anyone had initially expected. A few tourists began backing away, suddenly uncomfortable with being so close to what appeared to be an official military incident. Marcus fumbled for his wallet, nearly dropping it in his nervousness. "My passport is back at the hotel," he stammered, "but I have my driver's license here." "That will suffice for now," James said, extending his hand to receive the document. "Hotel name and address?" "The Premier Inn near Westminster," Marcus replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't remember the exact address, but it's the one about 10 minutes' walk from here." James carefully wrote down the information, his handwriting precise and military neat. Every few seconds he would look up at Marcus, as if studying him for additional details to include in his report. Sarah watched from the crowd, feeling helpless and increasingly worried about what this could mean for their vacation and potentially for Marcus's future. She had heard stories about people being banned from countries for various infractions, and the thought terrified her. An older gentleman who appeared to be a local approached one of the other guards and spoke quietly. The guard nodded and continued, watching the scene with professional interest. Marcus noticed this exchange and felt another surge of panic, wondering if more official involvement was on the way. "Mr. Chen," James continued, "you will now listen very carefully to what I am about to tell you." Marcus nodded eagerly, desperate to show that he was taking everything seriously now. "This incident will be reported through proper channels. Your behavior today has been recorded not only in my official report, but also by numerous witnesses with cameras and mobile phones. Your actions reflect not only on you personally, but on your country and your fellow tourists." Marcus felt his face burn with shame. He had never thought about representing America when he traveled, but now he realized that his behavior would be seen by many people as typical American tourist behavior. James closed his notebook with a sharp snap that made Marcus jump slightly. "However," the guard continued, and Marcus caught the first hint that there might be hope in this situation, "I am authorized to use discretion in how this matter proceeds." Marcus looked up hopefully, not daring to speak but clearly hanging on. "Every word." "You have shown genuine remorse," James observed. "Your girlfriend there appears mortified by your behavior, which suggests that this is not typical for you. And most importantly, you have cooperated fully with my questions." Sarah felt a small wave of relief, though she remained tense about what might come next. James stood even straighter if that was possible, and his voice took on an almost educational tone. "Mr. Chen, I am going to offer you an opportunity to turn this incident into something positive. Are you interested in hearing what that might involve?" Marcus nodded so vigorously that he nearly lost his balance. "Yes, sir. Absolutely yes, sir." "You will remain here for the next 30 minutes, James instructed. "You will observe how the guards conduct themselves, how respectful tourists behave, and how the entire system of royal protection operates with dignity and professionalism. You will not take photographs during this time. Marcus started to protest about not taking photos, but caught himself quickly. "I understand, sir. Furthermore," James continued, "you will approach 5 different tourists during this time and politely explain to them the proper way to interact with the royal guards. You will share what you have learned today about respect and appropriate behavior." The assignment was clearly intended as both education and penance. Marcus would have to face other tourists and admit his mistake while helping prevent others from making the same error. "If you complete this assignment satisfactorily," James said, "this incident will be recorded as a minor infraction with no further action required. Your name will not be forwarded to immigration authorities, and you will be free to continue your vacation." Marcus felt a huge wave of relief wash over him. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. I will absolutely do that. However," James added sternly, "if you fail to complete this assignment, or if you are seen behaving inappropriately anywhere near any royal residence during the remainder of your stay in the United Kingdom, the full weight of this incident will be applied. Do you understand these terms?" "Yes, sir." "Completely," Marcus replied, his voice stronger now that he could see a path forward. James glanced at his watch, a precise military timepiece. "It is now 2:15 p.m. You have until 2:45 p.m. to complete your assignment. Your girlfriend may accompany you, but she may not assist you in approaching the tourists. This is your responsibility alone." Marcus nodded again, feeling both grateful for the opportunity and nervous about having to approach strangers to discuss his own mistake. "One final point, Mr. Chen," James said, his voice returning to its original authoritative tone. "If I ever see you again in any circumstance that suggests you have not learned from today's lesson, there will be no second chances. The British military has a long memory for those who show disrespect." With that, James stepped back to his original position and resumed his stance as if nothing had happened. The transformation was remarkable. He went from being an intimidating authority figure back to being a silent, motionless guardian in a matter of seconds. Marcus stood there for a moment, not quite believing that the immediate crisis had passed. He looked around at the crowd, many of whom were still watching and recording, and realized that his real challenge was just beginning. Marcus took a deep breath and looked around at the tourists still milling about the palace grounds. Sarah approached him cautiously, her face showing a mixture of relief and concern. "Are you okay?" she whispered, reaching for his hand. Marcus squeezed her hand gratefully. "I think so. But I have to do this assignment and I'm terrified. How do I approach strangers and tell them about my own stupidity?" Sarah looked at him with new eyes. The cocky, social media-obsessed boyfriend she knew had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely humbled and reflective. "Just be honest," she said softly. "Tell them what you learned." Marcus spotted his first target, a young couple who were positioning themselves near another guard for photos. They were laughing and joking, and the man was making exaggerated poses that reminded Marcus uncomfortably of his own earlier behavior. With shaking hands, Marcus approached them. "Excuse me," he said politely. "Could I speak with you for just a moment about photographing the guards?" The couple looked at him curiously. The woman had a French accent when she spoke. "Yes? Is there a problem?" Marcus felt his cheeks burning but pushed forward. "I just had an experience that I think might help you have a better visit. About 15 minutes ago, I was doing exactly what you're doing now, and I learned the hard way that these guards are real soldiers with serious responsibilities." He told them about his encounter with James, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. The couple listened with growing attention, their playful mood shifting to genuine interest. "We had no idea," the man said. "We thought they were used to tourists having fun with them." "That's exactly what I thought," Marcus replied. "But they're protecting the royal family. They're not entertainers. The guard who spoke to me helped me understand that being respectful means keeping a proper distance and not trying to get reactions from them." The couple thanked him and moved to a more appropriate distance from the guard, taking their photos quietly and respectfully. Marcus felt a small surge of pride at his first successful interaction. His second attempt was with a family from Australia. The father was encouraging his teenage son to get closer to a guard for a better photo. Marcus's intervention led to a longer conversation about cultural respect and the history of the Royal Guards. The family was fascinated and grateful for the information. As he moved through his assignment, Marcus noticed something unexpected happening. Other tourists who had witnessed his earlier confrontation were watching his conversations with approval. A few even approached him to ask questions about what he had learned. One elderly British gentleman who had been critical earlier walked up to Marcus. "Young man, I saw what happened with the guard, and I must say I'm impressed with how you're handling this situation now." "Thank you, sir," Marcus replied. "It's been an eye-opening experience." "Good lad," the gentleman said. "Takes character to admit when you're wrong and try to make it right." By the time Marcus reached his fifth and final tourist interaction, he was feeling more confident. He approached a group of college-age Americans who were clearly planning something disrespectful based on their loud conversation about pranking the guard. "Hey, guys," Marcus said, his voice friendly but serious. "Before you do whatever you're planning, can I share something that just happened to me?" The group's leader, a young man wearing a fraternity t-shirt, looked annoyed at the interruption. "We're fine, dude. Just having some fun." Marcus persisted, telling his story with growing passion. As he described the guard's response and the lesson he had learned, he noticed the group's attitude shifting. Their plans for disruption faded as they began to understand the seriousness of what they had been contemplating. "Wow," one of the young women in the group said. "We almost made the same mistake you did. Thanks for stopping us." As Marcus finished his fifth conversation, he realized that something profound had changed in him. The experience had forced him to think about his actions, his impact on others, and his responsibilities as a tourist in a foreign country. Sarah had watched his entire assignment from a respectful distance, and she approached him with a smile. "You did really well," she said. "I'm proud of how you handled that." Marcus looked back toward James, who was still standing at his post. Though the guard's expression remained unchanged, Marcus felt as though there was a subtle acknowledgement in his posture. "I need to thank him," Marcus said suddenly. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" Sarah asked nervously. Marcus approached James's position, staying at a respectful distance. "Sir," he said clearly, "I wanted to thank you for giving me a chance to learn from my mistake instead of just punishing me for it." James didn't respond verbally, but he gave an almost imperceptible nod that Marcus took as acknowledgement. "I understand now what you were trying to teach me," Marcus continued. "About respect, about responsibility, and about thinking before I act. I won't forget this lesson." A small crowd had gathered again, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. People were listening to Marcus speak with respect and admiration rather than watching a spectacle. "I came to London thinking the guards were just part of the tourist experience," Marcus said, loud enough for others to hear. "But I learned today that you're real people with real jobs, protecting something important. Thank you for your service." This time, James's nod was clearly visible, and Marcus felt a sense of closure that he hadn't expected. As they walked away from Buckingham Palace, Marcus pulled out his phone and began typing. But instead of posting about his confrontation with the guard, he started writing about the lesson he had learned and the importance of respecting local customs and people while traveling. "What are you writing?" Sarah asked. "A blog post," Marcus replied. "But not the kind I was planning when we got here this morning." The experience had changed not just Marcus's afternoon, but potentially his entire approach to traveling and interacting with people from different cultures. The guard's cold response had led to something much more valuable than a viral video. It had led to genuine growth and understanding. 3 weeks later, Marcus sat in his apartment in Chicago, staring at his laptop screen. The blog post he had written about his experience at Buckingham Palace had received more engagement than anything he had ever posted. But unlike his usual content focused on getting likes and shares, this post had generated hundreds of thoughtful comments and messages from people sharing their own stories about cultural misunderstandings and personal growth. "Marcus, your coffee is getting cold," Sarah called from the kitchen, where she was preparing breakfast before they both headed to work. He looked up from his screen, still amazed by what had happened since their return from London. "You need to see this," he called back. "Remember that family from Australia I talked to at the palace? They messaged me with photos from the rest of their trip. They said our conversation completely changed how they approached visiting historical sites." Sarah walked over with 2 steaming mugs, setting one next to his laptop. "That's wonderful. But you know what I find most amazing?" "What?" "How much you've changed since that day," she said, settling into the chair next to him. "You used to only think about content and followers. Now you actually research the places we visit and think about the impact we might have on local communities." Marcus nodded, reflecting on how different his perspective had become. "James Patterson really knocked some sense into me. I keep thinking about what he said about representing my country when I travel. I never considered that before." The previous evening, Marcus had spent 2 hours responding to messages from other travel bloggers who wanted advice on responsible tourism. He had never positioned himself as an expert on cultural sensitivity before, but the authentic nature of his experience seemed to resonate with people in ways his previous content never had. "Did you see the email from that travel magazine?" Sarah asked, scrolling through his messages. Marcus looked where she was pointing. "Travel Plus Culture wants to interview me about the Royal Guard incident that changed everything? This is surreal." What neither of them knew was that across the Atlantic, James Patterson was also thinking about that day at Buckingham Palace. During his off-duty hours, he occasionally looked up social media posts about interactions with royal guards. It was partly professional curiosity and partly a way to gauge public perception of his role. He had found Marcus's blog post a few days after it was published and had been surprised by its thoughtful tone and genuine reflection. Unlike the usual tourist complaints or attempts to mock the guards, Marcus's post showed real understanding of the encounter and its significance. James had even shared the post with his commanding officer, who had commended James on his handling of the situation. "This is exactly the kind of educational approach we want to see," the officer had said. "You turned a potential incident into a teaching moment." Back in Chicago, Marcus was preparing for a local radio interview about his experience. The story had somehow found its way to a Chicago travel show, and they wanted to discuss lessons learned from cultural misunderstandings while traveling. "I'm nervous," Marcus admitted to Sarah as they drove to the radio station. "What if I come across as preachy or like I'm trying to make myself look good?" "Just be honest," Sarah advised. "Tell them exactly what happened and what you learned. That's what made your blog post so powerful. It was completely authentic." The radio interview went better than Marcus had expected. The host was genuinely interested in the story, and Marcus found himself speaking passionately about the importance of research, respect, and humility when visiting other countries. "So, what would you say to other Americans planning to visit London?" the host asked. "Do your homework," Marcus replied without hesitation. "Learn about the places you're visiting, the people who work there, and the cultural significance of what you're seeing. And remember that just because something makes good social media content doesn't mean it's appropriate or respectful." After the interview, Marcus and Sarah went to lunch at their favorite local restaurant. As they ate, Marcus's phone kept buzzing with notifications from social media and email. "This is getting overwhelming," he said, looking at the number of messages. "But in a good way, I think." One message particularly caught his attention. It was from a high school teacher in Denver who had used Marcus's blog post as part of a lesson about cultural awareness and personal responsibility. "Your story resonated with my students," the teacher had written. "Several of them are planning trips to Europe after graduation, and your experience helped them understand the importance of being respectful travelers. Would you be willing to speak to them via video call? Marcus showed the message to Sarah, who smiled broadly. Look at you, becoming an educator. 6 months ago, your biggest concern was getting the perfect selfie. It's strange how one embarrassing moment can completely change your perspective, Marcus reflected. I keep thinking about what might have happened if James had just ignored me, or if security had simply asked me to move along. I probably would have learned nothing. That evening, Marcus decided to do something he had been considering for weeks. He opened his laptop and began typing a letter. Dear James Patterson, Royal Guard at Buckingham Palace, I don't know if you'll ever see this letter, but I wanted you to know the impact our encounter has had on my life. What started as the most embarrassing moment of my vacation became the most important learning experience I've ever had. Your response to my inappropriate behavior could have been purely punitive, but instead, you chose to educate me. The assignment you gave me that day taught me more about respect, responsibility, and cultural awareness than any book or class ever could. Since returning to Chicago, I've been sharing our story not to embarrass myself further, but to help other travelers understand what I learned from you. Dozens of people have reached out to thank me for sharing the experience, and many have changed their own travel plans to be more respectful and informed. I wanted you to know that your patience and professionalism that day created a ripple effect that has reached far beyond that afternoon at Buckingham Palace. You didn't just correct my behavior, you helped me become a better person and a more responsible traveler. I hope this letter finds you well, and I want you to know that you have my deepest respect and gratitude for how you handled our encounter. Your service to your country and your dedication to maintaining the dignity of your position is truly admirable. With sincere appreciation, Marcus Chen. Marcus researched the proper channels for sending correspondence to royal guards and mailed the letter the next day, not expecting a response but feeling it was important to express his gratitude. 6 weeks later, he received a surprise in his mailbox. It was an official envelope with a British postmark and a formal return address. Inside was a brief handwritten note. Mr. Chen, your letter was forwarded to me through proper channels. I am pleased to learn that our encounter provided a positive learning experience and that you have chosen to share those lessons with others. The Royal Guards serve not only to protect, but also to represent the best traditions of service and duty. Your response to that day's events demonstrates the kind of growth and reflection that makes such encounters worthwhile. Continue to travel with respect and curiosity. The world needs more ambassadors like the person you have become. Respectfully, James Patterson, Grenadier Guards. Marcus read the letter 3 times before showing it to Sarah. They both sat in amazed silence for several minutes. He took the time to write back, Sarah said softly. That's incredible. Marcus carefully placed the letter in a frame on his desk, next to a photo from their London trip. Not the close-up shots he had originally planned, but a respectful picture of Buckingham Palace taken from an appropriate distance. Months later, Marcus's story continued to inspire others. He had started a small consulting business helping travel bloggers and social media influencers develop more responsible and culturally sensitive content. His catchphrase had become, "Travel with respect, not just for likes." The incident that had started as an attempt to create viral content had instead created something much more valuable, a genuine understanding of respect, responsibility, and the power of learning from mistakes. Marcus often reflected on how a single moment of poor judgment had led to the most important lesson of his life, all because one royal guard chose education over humiliation. James Patterson, meanwhile, continued his duties at Buckingham Palace, occasionally dealing with tourists who tested boundaries, but he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the right response at the right moment could change someone's entire perspective on life. In a job that often felt routine, Marcus's transformation reminded him that every interaction mattered and that his role extended far beyond simply standing guard. The story had come full circle, from disrespect to education, from embarrassment to growth, and from a moment of poor judgment to a lifetime of better choices. It proved that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected sources, and that true growth happens when we're willing to admit our mistakes and learn from those who know better.